60 Minutes with Angela starts right now.
It used to be called the Consumer Protection Council, CPC, but today it is the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, FCCPC. It is the #1 protection agency in Nigeria, established to improve the well-being of the people and protect her citizens in the marketplace. Essentially, the Commission's role is to prevent abuse, exploitation, and any form of mistreatment or disregard with respect to consumers. Babatunde Irukera has been overseeing the transition and operations of this commission since January 2019 and has contributed immensely to the rise in the profile of this commission. I wanted us to start with the name of the commission. You know, I know and I understand what consumer protection is, but what in the Lord's name is competition protection?
It's one of those words where it speaks for itself,
Yes.
but from a regulatory standpoint, it almost begs a question. And what it is that the history of competition would probably come from a long history in the United States of what is otherwise called antitrust. And antitrust has its history in what really is expected to be a fiduciary relationship, a position of trust between industry and consumers. And so what it is competition regulation is market regulation in some sense, making sure that the market is free. And the dominant economic theory and principle globally today is free market. And the free market means where you allow the market forces to decide the nature of the dynamics of the market, especially something like price. And so a free market means the government is not, one of the is called free market. There's a long history of government interfering in business or even really controlling business. And then you've got some of the old principles of socialism, communism. But capitalism itself had to progressively unlock the market. So a free market means let everything be negotiated freely in the marketplace between the seller and the buyer. And so you might think that a deregulated market means the government is out of it, and that's true. But there are other factors that can distort the market. For instance, if there are entry barriers, if it's difficult for someone else to get into the market to compete, that's a barrier to entry, and it distorts the market. It's price fixing. There's a cartel. If competitors can get together to fix prices, then essentially the market is not nearly as free as it is, because there is some externalities that affect what really would be a free negotiation. And there are a few other things, like subsidy. If a business is subsidized and another one is not subsidized, it's not a free market. The real full forces of the market, which is broadly characterized as demand and supply, but having many sub-characterizations and not operating clearly. Competition regulation is looking to each of those things, whether it's in a merger or acquisition, where a company that has maybe 60% of the market share wants to acquire another company that has 20% of the market share. And so that acquisition in itself promotes a level of dominance that could potentially become problematic. And so a competition regulatory system would address that. Might look at it and block the merger, or it might approve the merger with certain conditions, what are otherwise known as potentially structural remedies or behavioral remedies.
Yes.
So there are a few different things that are in the toolbox
Yes.
of a competition authority to regulate the market to make sure it's free.
All right. So in the United Kingdom, they have 8 consumer rights: adequate food, clothing, water, shelter, healthcare, education, public utilities, and sanitation. Are those consumer rights also available in Nigeria here?
In a manner of speaking,
Right.
yes. But in a matter of practice, I think Nigeria still scores significantly behind on a lot of those key ones,
Yes.
including the Sustainable Development Goals.
In February 2019, the President Buhari signed the new FCCPA Act, and that repealed the old one, the Consumer Protection Council Act, but now with more stringent penalties for violations and non-compliance. And these rules apparently apply to all goods and services providers in the country. Do you disagree with those who assert that this commission has an unusually wide jurisdiction covering every consumer issue in Nigeria? And for instance, how feasible is it to apply these rules in a technical industry like the aviation industry? Should aviation have been exempted, for instance, from it?
Well, to the extent that they make a statement of fact that the provisions of the FCCPA is pretty wide-ranging and covering the entire spectrum of commerce, I agree
Yes.
with them. But to the extent that they say that it's inappropriate, I strongly disagree. And it's a good example you give with respect to aviation.
Yes.
At the end of the day, the nature of what a consumer protection or a competition authority is quite specialized. And so taking aviation as an example, and we're not getting into the airworthiness of an aircraft. We're not getting into what the safety standards are. We're not discussing what the appropriate weather visibility should be or what type of equipment is even appropriate for the market.
Yes.
We're talking about the fundamental commercial principles of how passengers are treated, consumer protection.
Buying and selling.
Buying and selling. And the commerce of competition. It's simple. It's economic theory and legal theory. And that's what our specialty is. And that specialty, their principles.
Yes.
And they would apply in every industry anyway. We would study the market, we would do market studies, we would engage sector regulators in how to proceed, but none of the other sector regulators have the expertise or the specialties we have, which is focusing on consumer protection and competition regulation.
Yes, and so that brings us to the matter of aviation. I know I've been following the agency. On Wednesday, March the 2nd, 2022, your agency reacted to the move by domestic airlines, purportedly under the Airline Operators of Nigeria. Now, first thing, the AON, the Airline Operators, is a trade association. Is your commission regulating that group?
So the commission regulates all goods and services and any commercial activity. Whatever you do for the purpose of commerce is subject to regulation. And so a trade association in itself is not a business.
Right.
And so take the AON, for instance, doesn't have a license, doesn't have a air operator's license, doesn't have an aircraft of its own, doesn't have any passengers of its own. It's an association, it's a platform.
Yes.
And so the members of that platform are subject to regulatory authority. And as a matter of fact, the law apparently clearly, specifically states that you cannot, even on the platform of your trade association, engage in conduct that is inappropriate under law.
And it is inappropriate because you've used the word cartel. The commission has used the word cartel. Some people are reacting to that, saying, are you trying to fix prices of tickets for the airlines, in coming down hard, in saying that there was a coordinated increase, by the airlines, some of them? You also went ahead to say the commission has credible information that people at a meeting had arrived at a consensus and that the meeting ended in a resolution that encouraged, permitted, or consented to a coordinated conduct. So break it down for us. What is your quarrel with the domestic airlines increasing airfares?
And so the one thing that we're absolutely clear about is we respect the right and the prerogative of airlines to fix their fares.
Right.
In a free market, they're going to determine their fare based on whether the passengers want to get on the plane or not.
Right.
And that's how it should be. And to make that market free, we want all the competitors in there. We want to make sure that no competitor is handicapped against the other, so they can truly, fiercely, and robustly compete for the customer and patronage of consumers. Once that is happening, we're just on the back seat watching the market play out. Anything that disrupts that. So for instance, if the association gets together and they even discuss commercially sensitive information such as price, that is an illegal meeting.
Price fixing.
Just even discussing mutual pricing is against the law.
Really?
Everybody should go and manage the revenue models, their volumes, their supply by themselves. It is not for competitors to come together and have those conversations. It is the most egregious level of it. When you now sit around and say, by the way, let us agree on what the price is. What you've done is you've completely eliminated competition.
What if they're saying that because of the cost of aviation fuel, they've come together to discuss that, the effects of the high price of aviation fuel, and that discussion led into the discussion?
You must exercise control over your discussions. That's what the law expects of you. There's nothing wrong with, at an association level, coming to discuss issues of mutual concern or benefits to members of the association. There's nothing wrong with, at the association level, saying, look, we have a problem with the cost of aviation fuel. What are the things we can do to engage or even to promote efficiency in such a way that aviation fuel continues, the supply chain continues uninterrupted, or that the price of aviation fuel can be controlled? And so take, for instance, you have a co-located tank farm. You're doing co-location with tanking fuel from the service point onto the tarmac. You can have all those conversations. You can have conversations about how to make your businesses more efficient and all of that. But those conversations must be that what it is. You cannot from there say, and by the way, based on all these considerations and all the consents, I think it is only fair that we now agree on what the minimum fare for travel on Lagos, Abuja as a sector, for instance, is. You cross the line, and it's a red line.
It's a red line. What is the way forward now? Has the Commission expressed dissatisfaction to them? Are the airlines going to reduce these prices or change the prices?
So our problem is not a reduction or not.
Right.
I think we, from our role and our expertise, we're at least one step removed from determining the fairness or otherwise of their fares.
Right.
And because that's not the subject from a mandate standpoint, and then a follow-up to that is that even if that were the subject from a mandate standpoint, we would be arbitrary in determining whether it's high or low. And I understand consumers feeling that this is high. That's understandable.
Yes.
But the first component, the most important component to even correcting that system and allowing us to know what the price is first, let there be competition. Let one airline set its fare at what it considers profitable based on its own revenue management model.
Yes.
And let another one set its fare based on that. They operate this different equipment. They don't have the same number of employees. They don't have exactly the same input cost. You don't know who owes and what they owe. They're not leasing from the same company. Their lease rates are different. Their insurance premiums are different. Bunch of things that go into the cost, and which makes every business, airlines inclusive, determine what their margin, what their comfort point is. When that happens, then you can say, if the market is still not working well, then the competition authority can look again in its toolbox to find some other tool to address what the problem is. But at the minimum, let the market be free.
At the minimum, let the market
be free.
All right. So when you say let the market be free, is there going to be any form of punishment for them even discussing something that was illegal
in the first
per
place?
se? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the law provides that it is wrong, and if you violate the law, there should be a consequence.
Right.
However, because it's commerce,
Yes.
and what you want to do is some of the key exceptions to the black and white letter of the law or the elimination of the shades of gray,
Yes.
is that when conduct occurs in the context of commerce. And so a proper regulator in commerce must have a regulatory framework by the law that allows it to exercise its mandate on a spectrum. And that regulator must also have the skills and the knowledge and the sophistication and the intimacy with commerce to also know how to operate on that spectrum.
Yes.
And so, yes, I think that there's a consequence management system that requires consequences for this, but there are a bunch of other factors that we would consider to determine what the consequence should be, including, for instance, I'll give you a quick one. Competition regulation in Nigeria is recent. And this is a very mature economy where people have done their business in a certain manner. And so unlocking competition to its full possibility requires some management and navigation. And so we would exercise that. We would look at each of the situations, look at the conduct of the parties, look at the benefit to the parties, look at the injury to the consumers, and look at their responses to determine where on the spectrum. And that's why I can't say whether there's going to be a significant penalty or whether just corrective measure will be sufficient.
I want to take you now to what I'm calling unsolicited text messages and the way out for consumers who are experiencing it. I don't know if you wake up every morning and there's a text message that comes in, say from an insurance company. You didn't subscribe to it, but it's regular, it comes. And then I think, okay, is this a business model? Is the telecom operator making money from, selling phone numbers to these companies that are sending all these messages? What is the way out for a consumer who is not happy to receive those messages every day?
So that still exists, but to a far, it's much less than it used to be, because a framework was also created by the NCC, which was the Do Not Disturb. And you can sign up. There's a specific express act that a consumer takes to sign on to that, meaning I'm excluding my telephone from receiving unsolicited messages. Where I think the disconnect is, and the work still needs to be done, is whether the process of signing on to that is burdensome to consumers. I mean, the best possible consumer protection is for anything that a consumer needs to do to secure their protection to be not burdensome. And another theory might be, should default not be that do not disturb, and I have to opt in if I want to receive. And those are conversations that must occur based on consumer feedback and surveys and engagement with the primary regulator, in this case the telecommunications regulator.
Join us again after the break. Welcome back. Now let's go to the matter of money lenders. The National Information Technical Development Agency is partnering with you, the FCCPC, to prosecute money lenders who abuse debtors' data. That was a new thing. People went online to lend money, and then when they defaulted, the commission says they hacked into their contacts and start sending messages to the contacts saying, I've seen a few of those messages. This person is a chronic debtor and he doesn't pay his debts. But I'm not sure if the use of the word hack is right, because according to the people I've spoken with, they actually ask you at the time you're signing in or lending this money, they ask you for access into your contact. So, and I'm thinking from the legal point, you went to lend the money, you subjected yourself to their rules and regulations. So when they come back and behave badly, shouldn't you just swallow it?
Personally, I'm outraged by it. The reason is that our investigations so far just shows that it's just a wild, wild west space. Borrowers invariably, not necessarily even inadvertently, consent to that. But the role of Consumer Protection Authority is not limited to where consent occurs. It's also where it shouldn't even be a term of a contract in the first place. And so what we are saying is how important to borrowing money and recovering money is a public shaming and a reputational damage to literally everybody.
Anyone on your contact list. Yes.
How important, I mean, how is that a very important aspect of traditional lending and profiling for repayment? Getting around to developing the regulatory intervention in this space has taken quite some time and a lot of brain thrust in multiple agencies.
Can they still contact this commission?
Absolutely.
Right.
Oh, we're receiving emails every day. We're harvesting cases. We're harvesting information.
In other words, public shaming cannot be justified under any circumstances whatsoever.
I think I would not go nearly as to say under any circumstances whatsoever. But it's fair to say that it cannot be justified under the circumstances in which it is happening.
Okay. Under those specific circumstances. I saw that video. You know, they put a blob of margarine in pot and cooking. And I thought, you know, we've always used Blue Band when we cook jollof rice. It makes the rice moist because jollof rice can be very dry in the throat. And I read your website, I read the explanation, and some people are still insisting that it's fake. So I wanted you to just sort of educate us about why it seems that this margarine seems not to be melting, whereas if you use butter, you put it in the frying pan, it melts immediately. Good.
Now, what it is margarine. It's fat, it's trans fat. But what determines if it's margarine or not is really a standard threshold. When it doesn't make that threshold, it's not margarine. It's just another type of spread.
Right.
And depending on what it is, the spread is something that is held together by what you call emulsifiers.
Yes.
And those emulsifiers hold it together. You use it for bagel. It's different from the margarine you spread on your bread or that you fry your egg with. And so that it's not melting. It's not an indication of whether it is adulterated or whether it is substandard or fake or dangerous, by the way. No, it's exactly what it is. Spreads are spreads. They are not set up to melt under the same heat level as margarine would ordinarily melt. And so what this company did was they've got the Blue Band margarine and then they've got the Blue Band spread. And so what it is that some consumer must have bought the spread thinking that this was margarine. And so if there was a question here, it might be for a manufacturer who needs to do a little more work in differentiation.
Yes.
But the scientific evidence, and we have a quality assurance partner there with food science technologists and other scientists there. Pretty comfortable working with them, the standards organization, and even gathering information from NAFDAC that the spread is not dangerous because it doesn't melt. And that this product didn't melt, wasn't margarine that was substandard that failed to melt.
Yes. So it is safe.
Yeah, I mean, and so from a standard standpoint, I mean, there are all kinds of other arguments about the safety of consuming trans fat of health and lifestyle choices perspective. And so that's not the point I'm making. But from a standpoint of applicable standards, whether this is edible and whether the codex or SON standards already have accepted that the components or the ingredients of the blue band spread as it is safe for consumption? The answer is yes.
Right. Okay. Now, to this matter of 5 shipping companies, in 2021 last year, this commission established a case against 5 shipping companies allegedly involved in influencing high freight rates, including associated costs to the country. And I thought, is this another cartel operation we're seeing here?
The way we conduct our investigations is that if there's probable cause, we'll take a look into potential violation of law. And so we had credible intelligence that some coordination appeared to be going on in the shipping industry, and even identified some specific shipping lines who had been part of what really is a charter, as we call it, some charter about coordination. Some of the information we've also seen already points in the direction of other shipping companies that were not subject of search,
right,
which we would be expanding the investigation to.
Now, you've mentioned investigation a few times now, and you've also talked about, like FBI, you're doing some kind of undercover work. So when executing all these actions or search warrants, are there ever any altercations? Do you also prosecute these altercations when your men want to go in, for instance, and want access to some kind of sensitive information? Do they get a resistance?
I would say we've met with resistance. Some of the resistance have been more robust or more animated than others. But altercation in the sense of getting relatively physical or risk of significant injury, no, we haven't seen that. Now, it doesn't mean that there haven't been physical contact sometimes. But we've met with resistance, which is pursuant to law and in execution of a search warrant, we believe potentially be a violation of law in a criminal context, which is obstruction. Yes. And we've got at least 2 prosecutions going in 2 different industries where we executed search warrants, but certain executives or at least operatives of the subject of the search warrant resisted the agents of the operatives of the commission in discharging their work. Yeah. And the prosecution clearly is an important aspect of our work, and for industry to understand that there's a way to proceed, and to the extent that the conduct of the commission is legitimate in compliance with law and many times even pursuant to a court order, what the law requires is for you to cooperate.
I want to take you to section 33 now of the Act that sets up this commission. Failure and refusal to respond to a summons of the commission amounts to an offense.
It does, as it should be. I mean, how else can we do our work? What's different from that? That's the global standard. Yes. If the regulator asks you to come, you go. If they ask you for information, you provide it. If you fail to, they must find a way to compel you. And when, in addition to compelling you, they must find a way to penalize you for failing in the first place. Yes. Just imagine how completely impossible the work of regulating the space and protecting citizens would be. You regulator how to pull out, go through a truth extraction to get information from businesses. Yes. And so that, for me, are some of the most important areas. I'm more concerned about protecting the procedure and the processes of the institution and what the possible outcomes are. And so when there's a failure to respect the law, I stand strongly against that. I prosecute by myself. I go to court myself personally to prosecute. Because it's so important. There's no way we're going to build the institution. What we would prefer is not to have to intervene in the market nearly as much as we do. Yes. And it is only holding people accountable to processes that can create the appropriate deterrence, modify behavior for people to behave correctly. In the absence of consequence, there's absolutely no incentive to behave properly.
So, are you saying then that the repealed CPC Act it was near impossible to prosecute violators because the offenders would just not play ball.
Under the CPC Act, there were certain powers. Whether those powers were fully exercised or explored is a totally different thing. It's fair to say that the FCCPA certainly is a more robust piece of legislation that clarifies the powers, and you don't have to determine the scope of the authority of the regulator by inference, as could have been under the CPC Act. Now it's more express.
How could that law have been so defective, though?
I won't say that. I mean, law by itself is, even constitutions, the effort to repeal the Consumer Protection Council Act and enact the FCCPA is actually something that started before I took on the role. Was it a priority for me when I took on the role? Yes. Was it something that we dedicated resource to pursuing? Yes. And so I think to take the credit for all of that would be disingenuous.
Right. And you've also called for guiding principles for road haulage in Nigeria. What informed that call?
In a country where laws regulating and controlling even alcoholic consumption and driving, and laws with respect to infant restraint in vehicles, whether they're sitting up front or whether you're using a car seat or not. Too many things that constitute number one factors in fatalities in developed countries are not even applicable here.
Yes.
Yet we still have haulage being number one. And so, and to the extent that haulage, road is still the primary method of transporting goods and even hazardous and inflammable products and materials, it became very important that we needed some concerted effort beyond the FCCPC, but with other key agencies like the FRSC, police, LASMA. We need to come to some understanding, and even the trade unions, the trade associations and platforms within haulage, we need to come to some mutual understanding that we can't keep behaving like the ostrich, burying our head in the sand and thinking no one sees us and saying this is a regulatory failure or bad roads. There are things we just have to come together to do. And so that's why I think, the best thing is to promote guiding principles that we both agree on and we both adopt. So let's proceed from there to self-regulation, and then crystallizing that self-regulation into proper regulation where there are penalties. And so that's why we led the effort to promote guiding principles on what is appropriate. And there are a few things. One is roadworthiness of the vehicles, weight, what training the drivers have, rest hours, how many hours a driver can rest, and what are the tools we need to begin to monitor this. I think when we started with seat belts in this country, people thought it was unenforceable.
Yes.
But now that has moved to the market itself, people intuitively use their seat belts. When we started with traffic lights, and are we perfect yet? No, we're not. But people are far more disciplined with obeying traffic lights. So let's proceed with this also. It will take us to the next level.
Yes, take us to the next level. I wanted us to talk about a little practical example. So someone buys an air ticket, for instance, and then through negligence on the part of the travel agency, when the person gets to the airport to check in, they said, oh, sorry, this is not a return ticket. Your journey going is assured, but the return isn't booked. And so that person had to buy a fresh, full ticket. Now, defeating the purpose of buying a ticket earlier on. He wanted to get a cheaper ticket. So the cheaper ticket, let's say, was about $700. On the day of travel, because of a mistake by the travel agency, he ended up paying £1,200 for the same ticket return. Now, that agency is not coming forth, with what they want to do. I thought in that kind of situation, not only will you do a refund, you will also pay the difference in what he originally paid when he did the first ticket and what he ended up paying on the day. You know, what is the way forward for such a person, a victim?
The odds that the travel agent will get that wrong are, stacked really low. So if that happens, it's an almost unforgivable failure.
This is a real case.
If that came to me, I would hold that travel agent absolutely responsible to the entire cost of the inconvenience. There's absolutely no excuse for it.
The inconvenience of the 1,200
Absolutely. When I say the inconvenience, I'm talking about the cost of travel and additional inconvenience.
Yes, damages for that.
Absolutely, without question.
Can the person reach out to the commission in such a situation?
Absolutely. Go online. There's a portal to file a complaint.
Online?
Online, on the website. There's a portal to file the complaint. File the complaint there. It's going to give you a case ID number. It would respond to you. It gives you access to the portal for you to see the progression of your complaint. We will hold that travel agent accountable.
When we come back from the break, I want us to talk about taking action. The website for the commission is www.fccpc.gov.ng. That's www.fccpc.gov.ng. Join us again after the break. Welcome back. Now let's talk about taking action. The 3 steps. Take action, file a complaint. Track your complaint. Know your rights and responsibilities as a consumer. And I thought that's interesting that you use the word rights and responsibilities in the same sentence, because the truth is there can be no rights without corresponding responsibilities, can they?
The underlying theory of jurisprudence is that once there's a right somewhere, there must be a duty somewhere else for that right to use. But the interesting thing is, in the statement you make about knowing your rights and responsibilities as a consumer, the rights and the responsibilities are actually on the same side now. Very interesting reverse of jurisprudence. So you might as well be a philosopher. But there are 2 things. Consumers also have responsibilities. Let's be fair. My role is to protect consumers. That's my constituency. I'm not here trying to balance the rights of a consumer against the rights of a service provider. There's some other person who has that mandate. My mandate is to advocate for the consumer. However, I still recognize that even inherent in that advocacy and respect for the consumer's right are certain responsibilities. There's a certain manner of behavior.
He who comes with equity must come with clean hands.
Well, not even so much as that. It's actually even a matter of law also. For instance, if the consumer is abusive or physically abusing people at a checking counter, that's a problem. That's a problem. And so that's the responsibility from a restraint standpoint. And so there's also a responsibility from an active, not restraint standpoint. And that responsibility itself is a more important one in ensuring your rights are respected.
How?
And that is by taking specific action to enforce your rights. So one of the most important campaigns that I initiated and have pursued since I've been here is the Demand and Insist campaign. Demand your rights. When your rights are not respected, insist on them. When they're not respected, give me a call.
Demand, insist, and then FCCPC.
Because if you demand your rights, if consumers demand their rights, half the complaints we receive won't come here. And after demanding, then there's another half that will still come here. But of that half, if you demand and you insist, another 20%
will be taken care of.
Will be taken care of because you've insisted. And then there's the 30%. And that 30% is people who want to be recalcitrant, test the law, push the boundaries. The regulator and the legal process is here. And our work is so much easier and our society is so much better the most important component in any right enforcement mechanism in the world is a rights holder who has the audacity to demand, and when there's a failure, to even insist.
So you use the word audacity. Do you find that in these parts, in our climb here, there's a sort of, people hesitate a little bit. You don't want to be seen to be troublesome, really, in demanding rights. And for women, I'm speaking for women now, when you raise your voice and people look at you, this woman, she's troublesome when you're demanding. Do you find that at all?
So you're right. I mean, culturally, we are not assertive.
Yes.
And then, in addition, even when we're assertive, we're somewhat tentative as a people.
Yes.
And those are inconsistent with respecting rights. But I'd say that things are changing. The average Nigerian consumer is becoming far more discriminatory. And also, the more we entrench consumer protection and promote the social pact and commercial contract between the provider and the consumer, the less that will be. Because what you find is that consumers are even far more aggressive and unforgiving in excruciating us,
Yeah.
government, for the violation of their rights by somebody else who has a commercial contract with them. And so part of our work is consumer education, as we channel the nature of that relationship and say, listen, hold government accountable for regulatory failures.
Yes.
But not accountable for production failures. First, let's hold the provider as the initial and primary accountable person.
Yes.
And we're beginning to see that. One of the things that I've seen in the period that I've been on this job is that people are complaining far more than ever before. And many times people look at that as a failing grade in the sense that if you're doing your job, there shouldn't be that much complaint. No. People are complaining far more because we're succeeding in what we're doing.
Yes.
And so I think that history of culture, military rule, and all kinds of things, they're still part of the curve that we're turning. And I'm sure that we'll get better.
We'll get better. So let's talk about the process of taking action. You're online, so it's easy to access the commission through its website. When you file your complaint, what happens?
And so in addition to being able to go to a portal, you can go to the App Store and download.
You have an FCCPC app?
There's an app for you to file your complaint. When you file that complaint, you're going to receive a response that is a unique identifier for your complaint.
Yes.
And what we do is we immediately do some initial analysis. The case will be assigned to someone internally who would be the focal person to engage the target of your complaint or the respondent of your complaint, who would be engaged to see if there's a way to address the complaint one way or the other. There are other ways things can go. If it's a complaint that joins a pattern that we've seen in the industry, in addition to resolving it on your behalf, it might trigger an investigation. Because for the most part, what we do with complaints is try to resolve, but it also helps us determine if we need a more industry-wide intervention because of a pattern of a problem.
Yes. So when you say trigger an investigation, you've gotten complaints on a certain thing a few times, then you decide it's time to look deeper.
Or if we're still getting complaints with respect to a particular company and a product that we have engaged before,
yes,
and things have not changed.
All right. I want to take you back now to 1996. I mean, that's one of the things that you're famous for, Trovan.
Oh, gosh.
The largest meningitis outbreak in northern Nigeria, and that $80 million settlement that you achieved for the affected children and their families. Was that money ever paid? There's always been a
Absolutely, to the last cent.
$80 million.
$80 million. It was divided into two: a fund for healthcare priorities of Kano State, and a fund for compensation to those who could have been proven to have been part of the study.
Yes.
The fund for the healthcare priorities of Kano State is what has resulted in that the largest infectious disease hospital in Nigeria, in Kano, the Murtala and the Muhammadu Buhari infectious disease hospital on the outskirts of Kano, built over a number of years, extremely well equipped. It's the largest infectious disease hospital in Nigeria today. And then the fund for the victims, they set up a trust for that, and that trust had a team of people who created a process that the victims and their lawyers passed through, verified and demonstrated that they were included in the tests, in the clinical test, and they were paid. They were absolutely paid.
What was that case about?
Well, I mean, in 1996 when it happened, I didn't know at all about it. But in 2006 when I read about it, that's when we commenced the action on it. And what it was apparently at the time in 1996 when it happened, Pfizer was in the late stages of developing an antibiotic known as, at the time, Trovan. They'd gone through some stages of it. And so there was an outbreak of meningitis in Nigeria. And so some of these Pfizer researchers in the US saw that on the news and realized that it presented an opportunity to test Trovan against meningitis as an indicator. And so they had also progressed somewhat in the clinical test. It was stage 3 or stage 4 clinical trials that they were. And so they saw the situation in Nigeria as an opportunity, which in itself...
Was that a bad thing?
That's the point I was about to make. In itself, it's not necessarily bad to see that an outbreak of an epidemic is an opportunity for drug development. I mean, think about it. I mean, COVID, we've had to develop vaccination and medication against COVID right in the middle of the pandemic. So it's not necessarily bad. What the issues were was the parameters, the standards, and the appropriateness of conduct in the process. And one of the things that established that was that there are laws. You must obey those laws. There's a process you must go through. And then there's what you call the ethical committee. What the ethical committee is that when you develop your test, your design and protocol, there's an ethical committee of experts that must look at it and say, this protocol that you've developed would work well and will not endanger lives. And that ethical committee would look at the entire protocol, look at the circumstances under which you want to conduct the test, whether it's a controlled test in a hospital or an epidemic where there are hundreds of people. It would look at all of that. And if the protocol needs to be modified, it will be modified. What it was that Pfizer didn't have that ethical committee clearance.
Was that because they thought they're coming to deep dark Africa where we don't know anything?
What I can say for sure is that it was wrong. And Pfizer knew from experience that it was required. It was when Pfizer made an application to the US FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, a new drug application, to try and get Trovan approved, and presented some of the outcomes of the clinical trial in Nigeria as part of the efficacy of the medication, that the US FDA asked for the ethical committee approval.
And there was none.
And what the investigation concluded at the time was that Pfizer now procured one that was backdated. And so the question of the proprietariness of the conduct was questionable. And there are all kinds of other allegations that were also part of what was going to be a very, very contentious civil case and criminal prosecution. But none of those cases went forward because Pfizer elected to otherwise resolve without pursuing the judicial process to the very end.
And that brings me to the question of the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines. There's still very little penetration in terms of how many people have been vaccinated. And there's a very strong resistance. People think that because normally vaccines take years to develop, this one that came within 2 years, they think that there's something wrong with it, or people don't want to be guinea pigs.
And so here we are trying to decide whether the glass is half full or half empty. I think it's half full. I'm convinced. I'm absolutely 100% persuaded, convinced, both from personal experience, just from reading from open sources, from engagement with scientists and even other regulators in the drug control space or disease control space, that the vaccinations are absolutely efficacious.
So you'd encourage Nigerians who haven't taken the vaccine to do so?
Beyond encouraging, I'll plead that it's so important that we take the vaccination. More important for us to take the vaccination here than it is even in the West.
And on the matter of importation of substandard fuel, those whose automobiles were affected with this high method, whatever,
off-spec, we call it off-spec
fuel, can they resort to your commission for help? Or?
And some have, but what we found to be far more methodical and certainly less chaotic approach to handling that was in part our engagement with the primary regulator, the mid and downstream regulatory authority, and even the NNPC, who quickly came up with what was the method to what was a chaos. Engaging the retailers, saying, look, for people who bought fuel from you, if they have a problem, let them return to you, because that's the primary point.
Yes.
And that's the best screening point. And that, as much as we understand it, has worked somewhat. But of course, there's some problems where the damage or injury is significant, and beyond that, like you said, damage to engine and all that.
Yeah.
So our legal departments in the FCCPC, the regulator, the NNPC is sitting together, develop a framework for those isolated cases. And we're not seeing that many of them, I might say. I don't know that we're not seeing them because people have resigned to the damage, or really because a lot is being resolved at the lower level. With respect to ultimate responsibility and culpability, the NNPC is obviously engaging from a refiner and importer level to see how, whatever the damages for injury can ultimately rise up the ladder and rest at the place where it should. And we're satisfied with that process, but we're watching it. To the extent that we're dissatisfied on behalf of consumers, our law gives us the opportunity to intervene somehow.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Irukera, for coming on 60 Minutes with me today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. I'm Angela Ajitumobi.